Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Terminal Philosophy to continue our series on the history of warfare. And we will be dealing with the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age and the Bronze Age catastrophe and its immediately succeeding centuries. So to sort of set up the narrative, where we left off with at the Battle of Kadesh and the peak of the Bronze Age, we have a series of Bronze Age empires that are reliant upon a military aristocracy rooted in the use of chariot weapons platforms and bronze armor and equipment. And these great empires, which include Mycenaeans, Minoans, Hittites, Mitanni, Ugarit, Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, are all competing for the same sort of trade routes and scarce resources like tin. Tin is mostly found in Afghanistan and Cornwall in England. And so the trade routes out west to England were in part explored by the Phoenicians. There was also the eastern trade route to Afghanistan to larger deposits. Now, there's a certain theory that's developed that the late Bronze Age civilizations were in a sort of like proto-globalist alliance where they were generally trading and generally peaceful. And that's just not really borne out by the facts. The Middle Assyrian Empire was growing in all directions, south and west, during this late Bronze Age period, and was one of the few kingdoms to survive the catastrophe. Egypt and the Hittites were skirmishing on and off in Palestine at Kadesh. So there's no really, while the trade routes were vitally important, there's no reason to assume that these nations were peacefully trading with one another. They were competing for access to those trade routes because in some sense, access to the tin would be the difference between victory or defeat on the battlefield. And these great kingdoms also, many of them had walled cities as well. And they look as strong as ever. They look as strong as ever. And then what we see happening is from the transcriptions on stelae by Ramesses III, some cuneiform tablets from Ugarit by the ruler of Ugarit. A mysterious people from the sea invade and conquer these Bronze Age civilizations of the West. And the Egyptians say, we're like the last ones left. We're the only people left standing. You know, this might as well be the end of the world. Now, in the West, these sea peoples are the culprit. Now, in the East, the Babylonians collapse and the Hittites collapse, and there seems to be evidence that these are in part due to an Iranian race called the Gutians, who also were putting this pressure from the East. So there's kind of this double pressure from these directions, where these nations on the outside of this Bronze Age consensus are encroaching in on these kingdoms and destroying them. And the key invention here that makes this all possible is iron. Now, bronze at this point is a highly refined metallurgical process. So while the best bronze equipment is probably of superior quality to the iron equipment at the time, the iron equipment is far more common, and the differential between quality is not enough that it offsets the benefit of equipping large groups of men in iron and equipping them with armor weapons and iron armor. And so we have this takedown of these Bronze Age kingdoms. Now, this was the consistent narrative throughout much of the 20th century when it came to understanding the collapse of the Bronze Age. And this occurs mostly because it's the only one that has any actual textual evidence to back it up. The Egyptian stelae and the Ugarit cuneiform tablets. But recently, people have speculated there might be climate change, famine, drought, plague, or also internal civil unrest, which led to the poor taking the proletariat overthrowing the bourgeoisie. The problem with these other later narratives is, one, they have literally no textual support, and two, they just smack of 20th and 21st century anachronisms being superimposed on antiquity. Nobody in antiquity would couch this in terms of ecological breakdown. They would probably couch it in terms of the gods punishing them for their sins, as though what they understand this broader problem is. And there is no written accounts or later oral tradition. So, for example, one might view the Iliad as an oral tradition of this period, referring to organic proletariat uprisings. So, other than the fact that there's really no evidence for any of this, I think they're popular mainly because they serve certain political interests. But the more broad issue here is empires never collapse from purely environmental factors. If you were to write a paper saying the Roman Empire collapsed due to deforestation, you'd be laughed at. The Roman Empire collapsed because of Germanic invasion. And so what we could probably argue is that these Bronze Age empires were so busy competing for these trade routes in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Palestine and Canaan, that they were not paying attention to outside forces, outside pressures that were developing, which would eventually cascade in. And really, from around 1200 till around 900 BC, we have little to no written records of what's going on in the area. So a dark age occurs, and in historical jargon, a dark age means a period in which we don't have a lot of textual evidence, whether that be tablets, papyri, or stela. Do you have any thoughts to add on that terminal philosophy?
Yeah, well, the first thing to address for this area, like in our previous episodes for this series, is that even though we're advancing in terms of metallurgy, we're still firmly locked within the proto-historical era, meaning we're still in an era where there's just not much to go off of other than papyrus and what has been depicted on, funerary temples and things like that. For the Eastern Mediterranean, the Iron Age lasted from about 1200 BC to 600 BC, or from the late Bronze Age collapse until Herodotus. So that means that archaeology is the best game in town in terms of evidence gathering, which unfortunately isn't saying much for the ways in which we interpret the past. We're still more or less subject to the ideologies and cultural biases of Western archaeology. With that being said, as far as warfare is concerned in the Iron Age, I think you and I would both agree that the Battle of the Delta in the 1170s BC is one of the foremost events to analyze warfare for this era. Although the Sea Peoples were successful in apparently destroying the Hittites and the Mycenaeans and the Mitanni and contracting their early Assyrian vassals, the Sea Peoples were defeated, that we know for sure, at least twice by Ramses III in the 1170s BC. First, it was the Battle of Dijahi, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of, but that's Djahy, which is where the draining the draining basin for the Jordan River, and then the Battle of the Delta. Like you and I were talking about beforehand, it's because there's such a lack of strong evidence for so many things. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that the Sea Peoples were masterful tacticians. It's more that they probably had this sort of Viking-esque amphibious assault capability on settlements that had little to no fortifications. And there's also not a lot of evidence that would suggest that they were organized in the way that they had specialized units like archers or organized formations. It's more that they had this naval capability to begin with that created this huge reputation that they now have up until this point. I'll probably keep it at that.
Yeah. Now, one aspect of what allowed the Sea People to be so successful, I think a helpful rubric for understanding the late Bronze Age period is much like at the beginning of the 7th century AD. Rome and Persia had been engaging in a centuries-long feud that goes back to literally the 1st century AD. And after all these centuries of fighting, they're exhausted. And the Saracen tribes, which united under Muhammad, under the zeal of Islam, which under normal circumstances would never have dared challenge the Persian and Roman empires, just sweeps them aside. And I think what we see is the Hittites and Egyptians, for example, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and possibly the Hittites and the Mycenaeans were engaged in these long conflicts that were drawn out, indecisive, leaving everybody vulnerable. And in fact, in the Ugaritic tablet, where the ruler, the prince, requests that his father give him aid, he says, "My troops are at Hattusha, and my ships are at Lucca." So they're not even defending the capital city. It's like they've been on campaign. They're exhausted. They haven't been fighting decisive engagements. And I think all of these empires look strong on the outside, but they were, I think, kind of like punch drunk in the same way that Rome and Persia were at the 7th century. And now we get to the actual sea peoples themselves. Now, who were they? That's the $1 million question. There's an inscription in Egypt on Medinet Habu, where it describes the defeat of the sea peoples at the Battle of the Delta by Ramesses III. And the tribes that are mentioned, the Dinyen, the Ekwesh, the Luka, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Sheridan, the Tiresh, the Tjeker, and the Weshesh. These groups have been associated, the Dinyen with the Greeks, Denoi, the Ekwesh possibly to the Greeks, the Luka to the Lucians. The Peliset, rather, most people agree are the Philistines of biblical fame. The Shekelesh might be Sicilians. The Sheridan might be Sardinians, and elsewhere. So there tends to be an idea that the ethnic composition of the sea people were either Southern Italians or Greeks. And as they became successful, now if we view the Iliad as a sort of memory of this period, we know that when Ulysses returns to Greece, well, not just Ulysses, all the Greek heroes, their homesteads are in ruins. They've been plundered by, in fact, invaders. I mean, when Ulysses comes back home, he has to kill all the suitors who are trying to steal his property and seduce Persephone. So we could argue that there was this displacement. Now, the classic interpretation was there was a tribe of invaders called the Dorians who were using iron weapons that displaced the Mycenaeans, who then displaced the Minoans, who then created this snowball effect of raiders and pillagers. The author of 1177, Klein, he seems to think that the Dorians didn't exist, but I don't really like a lot of his theories because they tend to be very ideologically determined rather than determined by actual historical precedent or historical records. Archaeologists tend to like to find interpretations that go against everything we observe in history because reasons, I guess. But I think the Dorian invasion is plausible enough, and the fact that the sea peoples themselves, how do they wage war? How are they equipped? Well, their primary strategic mobility was due to sea power, which would apply Minoan, Cretan, and Mycenaean origins because the Minoans controlled the trade routes throughout the Bronze Age from around 3000 to 1500 BC. They controlled trade routes not only between Greece and Egypt, but up into other parts of Europe like Italy and England. So that would be quite plausible. So maybe the Mycenaeans, took ships and then conquered, invaded and looted Sicily or Crete, and then took more ships and continued to loot the rest of those kingdoms. They tended to have shields and armor, shin guards, greaves, cuirasses, helmets. They also tended to favor close quarter combat with swords and spears. They are reported using javelins, but not really a lot of not a lot of bows. So if we look at, say, the accounts in the Egyptian stelae, the Egyptians are using bows, but not the sea peoples, which would also, I think, solidify a Greek connection, because in the Persian Wars, the Greeks don't really use archers. They use heavy infantry armed with spear and shield and heavy armor. Whereas the Persians, using Near Eastern tactics, tend to favor loose formations with archers. And I think that also further solidifies the sort of Indo-European or Greek origin of the Sea Peoples. And it was really more the fact that they could just strike out of nowhere that made them so terrifying. Because if they could be brought to battle at the sea, the Egyptians and the Hittites could score naval successes against them. So it was really more a surprise, and probably also their new iron technology that made them so successful. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think about who were the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse after everything had happened. I mean, you really only have a handful. I mean, really, it's just Egypt, and then you have a contracted form of the early or middle Assyrians that are basically on the Tigris and east of the Tigris River. And then you have the Elam Empire, which is down by the modern day Persian Gulf. But other than that, it took a lot of rebuilding. And yeah, again, I think we both agree that I more or less agree with you on the origin of the Sea Peoples, that they eventually were, the Peliset and settled in modern day, well, in Phoenicia, which would be modern day Gaza, I guess. But yeah, it's interesting to see what that event created, because ultimately it would create this sort of this regional and power vacuum in modern day northern Syria and in central Syria, because you have the Assyrians fighting over basically a stretch of territory where you'll have to remind me of the name. The Aramaean people is kind of like a loose confederation of Aramaean settlements that they fought against. And this would ultimately, out of the Bronze Age, you would have the reformation of some certain Babylonian city states, and from there is some evidence of some Iron Age battles with, well, iron weapons, I should say, between the Assyrians and these Babylonian city states. And after that, there is some evidence to suggest that the Assyrians went on what some archaeologists called metal raids to the north, up towards the modern day Caucasus Mountains, not that far north, but certainly in that direction. And what that ended up doing was uniting some of these sort of informal Western Iranian tribes, like the Neri tribe and the kingdom of Mana, as well as the kingdom of Lippi. They more or less formed about a century later, after these raids, the territory of the Urartu. It's Urartu. That was kind of an interesting formation. So yes, out of the Bronze Age, you have this total economic and sort of infrastructural collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean region, but it does slowly sort of rekindle this rebuilding of certain empires, most of which ended up having both iron weapons and a lot of iron tools for their civilian life as well.
Now, the actual first smelting of iron is a bit of a mystery that is highly debated. I know you've looked a little bit into that. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, it's fairly popular. It's a fairly popular view from modern archaeology that iron smelting started with the Hittites in central Anatolia, but after you look into that a little bit, it's really just kind of speculative archaeological kind of guesswork. I hate to deduce it to that, but it's possible that there's better evidence to suggest that iron smelting happened slightly earlier than when the Hittites had in places like southern Europe, places like northern Greece and Italy or the Balkans, that were brought down to Asia Minor and places like that. But yeah, again, that's a difficult debate. I looked into it a little bit, and that's what you would come across in textbooks, that iron was smelted in Anatolia, but it's really, I don't know. It's kind of anyone's guess. I mean, again, there's some slightly more compelling work on the Southern European hypothesis as far as the origins of iron smelting go.
Yeah, and that would also indicate now one of the strongest evidence is that the Sea Peoples used iron was that the Philistines, who we've identified with the Peliset, are in literary accounts reported to have had an iron monopoly, which the surrounding nations didn't have. So it's strongly likely that they brought iron with them, and if they have, we assume, a Greek or Italian origin for the Philistines, then somewhere in the that region, iron was utilized as a weapon. But also, we see evidence of iron warriors in the Caucasus and in Iran, as I mentioned earlier. Of the two major kingdoms that survived, the Assyrians and the Egyptians, we'll begin with the Assyrians. The Middle Assyrian Kingdom, if you look at its era of expansion, it was yoked under the Mitanni Empire, which was destroyed by the Sea People's invasion, and actually seems to enter into a period of expansion against Babylonia and against Syria at the time of this collapse. It's almost like they're taking advantage of this collapse. And one of the things that we see with the Assyrians is that in the Middle Assyrian period, their army was primarily militia system, partial conscripts. And they were on and off war with their neighbors continually. So the Assyrians were a highly militarized state that had a relatively large proportion of their population, a male population geared for war. And because they were on the frontiers of this Bronze Age culture, and they were actively engaging in conflicts with these new tactics and these new strategies that were being implemented by iron-wielding nations, they were positioned to take advantage of that and evolve in their strategy and tactics alongside these new rising states, so they were not caught flat-footed. And furthermore, I think the mountainous nature of Assyria probably facilitated a focus towards infantry, which, as we'll get to, is the broader trend of the Iron Age, where the chariot is ultimately displaced by massed infantry formations. And there does seem to be some evidence that while the Middle Assyrian Empire had expansion, there was also a period of contraction as well, where during the worst elements of this destabilization, they contracted to the heartland. And once they had resisted that, then they were able to move forward. But it seems that the Assyrians, I think a better case can be, especially in light of the Neo-Assyrians, that the Assyrians were the first nation to consistently use iron on a large scale, Philistines notwithstanding. And that was probably the key to the Middle Assyrian survival, is they had access to this before many of the other surrounding nations did.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it's fine to think of Assyria as taking advantage of the collapse of the Bronze Age because they were far east enough to be away from the coastlines of amphibious attack, but just close enough to these former great empires that there was some sort of regional and political vacuum to go after. So yes, after that, after the collapse of the Bronze Age, you have basically the formation of what could be considered something like Aramaean, like petty states and kingdoms that were that had more or less a lot of territory from, you could say, modern day Baghdad to bordering the Phoenicians on the coast of the Mediterranean. So the Assyrians would end up fighting Babylonia, as well as what archaeologists consider the Neo-Hittites. But one other, I think, or actually two or three other powers that should be mentioned that come out of the Bronze Age, despite them not really, they're kind of like a hollow shell of their former self, at least in that region, and that would be the Phrygians of Central Asia Minor, the Lydians of Western Asia Minor, and basically the city-states of Lycia in Southern Asia Minor. So they more or less did come out of the Bronze Age, but there's not a lot of information to see to say how well they thrived from iron, or what kind of economies they had, and what their populations were, so on and so forth. But the Assyrians, I think, as we'll ultimately come to agree on, that would lead to the Neo-Assyrians, which dominated the entire region all the way from large portions of Turkey to all of modern day Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Israel and all the way down to Egypt. They definitely did make this. It was successful because of their ability to create so much iron. Because I think there really is enough evidence to suggest that they did go to these raids in the north, because they were still centered around the northern portions of the Tigris River, which weren't quite in fully mountainous regions. But I think that's one reason why I think that they had to go further north, because all throughout Asia Minor it's mostly mountainous, and that's one reason which supports the popular hypothesis that the Hittites were the ones doing iron smelting the earliest on a larger scale. But I still think that theory overall doesn't quite hold up as well as the Southern European. But yeah, we'll come to find out that Assyria really does, it expands and contracts in fighting with both Babylonia and the Aramean kingdoms and sort of petty states. But after the Egyptians basically are destroyed through not being able to pay a lot of their militia, because they ended up hiring a lot of the descendants of sea peoples as militiamen. But in the Third Intermediate Period, they ultimately ended up losing their independence, and they were from there on out forever under foreign rule.
Yeah. Now, the first, as far as I can tell, the first detailed account of a naval battle in history is the Battle of the Delta, where Ramesses III defeats the Sea Peoples. And broadly, what we understand is it goes something like this. Presumably because the Nile was a long river and the Sea Peoples had superior seamanship skills, it would seem natural enough that they could sail, they would sail down the river and loot along the way, as they had done throughout the rest of the Mediterranean. And the Egyptians decided to take advantage of the marshy terrain of that area of northern Delta region of Egypt, and placed their spearmen along the shores to sort of keep the enemy from, if you will, landing or disembarking their ships. And then along the reeds, and they placed battalions of archers. And so as they lured the Sea People fleet in, they kind of get stuck in this marshy, swampy area, and then the Egyptian fleet comes up behind, and they fight a quasi-land battle floating on these galleys. And from the artwork, we see that, again, the Sea Peoples don't really have a lot of archers. The only real ranged weapon they have is a javelin or a throwing spear, whereas the Egyptians have rank upon rank of archers. And that seems to be the decisive element, where they just pelted these Sea Peoples and eventually stormed the ships and took them. And also, as was mentioned previously, they had hired Sea Peoples as mercenaries. And I think the Peliset to be Philistines were actually settled in Gaza by the Egyptians. So we see that the Egyptians did beat the Sea Peoples, but it was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, as was mentioned. The Third Intermediate Period developed because they could not pay the Sea Peoples that they had turned. Now, why is this? What are the important trends that the Iron Age begins? The important trends that the Iron Age begins are the rise of infantry and the decline of chariotry. So one of the things that we see is that, again, even though iron was slightly inferior at its because it's a relatively new science compared to the bronze smelting techniques, it's good enough, and it's everywhere. You can equip whole armies in iron, and these same trends are going on in China as well. And we see that from around 770 BC to around 400 BC, we have a sort of aristocratic Bronze Age where there's chariots and there's duels, and it's all very almost chivalric, where you don't kill enemy captured generals or captured nobles, and you fight individual duels in a very Homeric fashion. And then with the rise of iron technology in China, we have these vast hordes of infantry, numbering hundreds of thousands, leading to these, cataclysmic battles of infantry armed and with iron weapons, covered in iron armor, and it really just exponentially grows the scale and cost of war. And we see a very similar trend in the Near East, beginning with the Assyrians, continuing all the way up through the Roman Empire, where there's this trend towards massed infantry formations. And one of the things driving these mass infantry formations is the prevalence of fortified cities. As we'll get to in a later lecture, the Assyrians were masters of siegecraft. And of course, cavalry, chariots especially, are relatively impotent, and cavalry in general are impotent in such conflicts where you need to have infantry, whether of the shock variety for storming the gates or the missile variety for keeping the enemy's heads down. And this drive to take fortified cities definitely prioritizes infantry. And we also see that infantry are cheaper to maintain than chariots, because with a chariot, you not only have to maintain the horses, which is at least 2, so maybe up to 4 horses per chariot, depending on the nation fielding them. And then you've got to have essentially workshops to make the chariot carts and the wheels and the axles, and they can break and you need replacements. And as far as combat effectiveness, you have at least 2, as you mentioned, maybe 3 men per chariot cart, and only one of them can really fight. So, whereas if you just equip 3 soldiers, they can all fight. There's no diminution of combat value in that regard. And we also see the rise of cavalry in the Iron Age. I think, again, also because it's more combat effective, 1 man, 1 horse. You can skip the workshop with the wagons, makes everything a lot easier. But it's generally a trend towards bigger. And you can go bigger because you have a larger metal supply and easier access to a very large and relatively easy accessible metal supply called iron. And at least in the West, this leads to an interesting trend, which we'll get to in more detail later when we turn to the Greeks. But the rise of armored infantry formations in the West also leads to the rise of democratic, republican, representative institutions, where the people are saying, well, hey, if you want us to fight, you're going to have to give us an incentive to fight, because we're just not going to go along with it. And so, now that didn't happen in the East, in China, and it didn't happen in the Near East or in Egypt. And one might argue because these are large, flat areas where chariots and later cavalry are still dominant, and cavalry armies tend to be more aristocratic. And so the idea of appealing to popular sentiment doesn't really happen. Whereas in Italy and Greece, it's very mountainous. There's not a lot of pasture land for horses, except in a few niche areas, and where aristocratic and noble houses don't really reassert themselves after the collapse of the Bronze Age. So iron is important for really 3 things. It leads to mass infantry armies. In the West, it leads to the rise of representative institutions, and it also coincides with the rise in siege warfare. Because siege warfare is so important in later centuries, infantry become indispensable, even more so than cavalry in some cases.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with all of that. I mean, this is really the introduction of large infantry formations and the diminished use of chariots for all the reasons you just named. I mean, again, they're both kind of a logistical, taxing thing to deal with, and they're also kind of a weird cultural military sentiment kind of a thing where, yeah, like you said, it's kind of an aristocratic battlefield sort of entity. But after you see the rise of a lot of large infantry formations from the Middle Assyrians and the Egyptians, well, no matter how skilled you have your cavalrymen, or sorry, your charioteers be, there's just nothing that they can do to chip away at these huge formations of infantry. And really what comes out of this era is the rise of cavalry from the Assyrians in the 8th century BC. I think that really changed the battlefield forever. And there is some archaeological evidence of things like bridles and like early something like a stirrup and saddles, things like that. But again, it's just easier to throw one infantryman on a horse and train him how to, of course they have to domesticate horses, but yeah, there's no going back to the chariot after this, at least in terms for the Eastern Mediterranean. Perhaps maybe from Cyrus the Great, but that's a little bit later on. But I think he might have been the last guy to use chariots in that region.
Yeah, exactly. And this change, I think, while we can see it in West Asia and Europe, it should also be noticed that the same thing is again going on in China. And one innovation that happens in China long before it happens in the West is the advent of the crossbow. And so people have often speculated that one of the reasons why the age of chariots ended in China was the mass production of crossbows. And of course, using iron for the tips and for the mechanisms in the bow would lead to a much more robust and versatile system than bronze, which is rather brittle and soft. And so while we see vast infantry formations developing, what's different, though, is in West Asia, they tend to still be compound bowmen, composite bowmen, which are the backbone of the armies, whereas in China, they're the crossbow. And the crossbow arguably can allow, because it's simpler to train someone to use, you can arguably train more quote-unquote archers in the use of the crossbow than you can in the use of the composite bow. And so we see these pressures. And as well, we see pressures for the development of cavalry, which take place in this period between 1200 and 900. And one of the things that leads to the development of cavalry, it seems to be the nomadic peoples were the first to develop the use of actual cavalry. Because, for example, in China, during this period, the Warring States period, the Yan tribe in the north was one of the first Chinese to use cavalry formations, and they were in constant conflict with the Xiongnu, later the Huns. And it would seem that as well, the Scythian tribes of the west also used cavalry effectively. And it's quite likely that the Assyrians adopted, much like their Chinese counterparts, adopted horse warfare from these more nomadic steppe peoples. Because the general rule is that advancements in equestrian technology and tactics, beginning with the chariot, does develop on the steppe. And so those nations closer to the steppe, like northern Chinese principalities or Syria, tend to be the ones that are the first of the, quote, civilized nations to adopt these new techniques.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. I think the only other thing I can really say as far as this era goes is that, iron it completely changed the way warfare was conducted, and because it was it was easier to produce on a mass scale than it was to wait for tin to arrive from Afghanistan for most of these empires in the ancient world. But it completely changed military life, and it completely changed civilian life, because all these tools were converted over to iron. And because of the sort of cataclysm of the Bronze Age collapse, the need to learn how to smelt iron became it became necessary for survival. And I think one reason why the Egyptians, I mean, they did have a lot of weapons that were later made into steel, but there wasn't that never happened on the mass scale that it probably should have, in order for them to maintain and to just sort of be with the times, so to speak. But yeah, really, this is the kind of the diminishing use of chariots and larger infantry formations. And like we talked about earlier, I don't know that there's actually a really clear-cut line between ancient and medieval warfare, But where it does become clear between both of them is the use of more advanced siege equipment and innovations in armor and weapons, especially like stronger types of steel and forge technology where you can smelt iron at higher degrees, and things, and siege equipment like trebuchets and so on and so forth. But yeah, this proto-historical era is difficult to deal with because just from such a lack of information. Really, the best information that survives from this era is just on papyrus and uh, wall inscriptions, especially on Ramses III funerary temple. Again, it's kind of funny that all of this information of the proto-historical era is mostly about war. I think there's some stuff about famines and diseases, which was interpreted mythologically, but most of it is just warfare, man. I mean, that's really kind of that's the prime event of this 600-year period in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah. I think the other thing to point out is the general trend of we mentioned in our last episode Bronze Age infantry formations, largely loose order formations of spearmen and some axe and macemen to hack through the armor of the bronze armor, and then large bodies of archers. We saw at Kadesh how the Egyptians used archers to defend the camp against the Assyrian, the Hittite chariots, and we see similar trends in China. And broadly speaking, loose order infantry formations throughout Eurasia are the norm for infantry formations. That trend does not change. That's largely the result that Asiatic armies prioritized missile weapons, slings, javelins, and most importantly, in the West and in West Asia, the composite bow, and in China, the crossbow. Now, but here's the thing: iron does allow for the development of massed, close-ordered heavy infantry formations. Because one of the reasons why infantry prior to this likely did not fight in close formation is because while bronze might have offered sufficient protection, it was too sparse to equip enough troops to march shoulder to shoulder to weather the storm of arrows that would be unleashed by chariots or massed infantry formations. And they would just be shot to pieces and would be a waste of those forces, whereas a loose formation would reduce the amount of damage that incoming missiles would do. But once you could equip large bodies of men in iron, as we see with the Greeks and the Romans, now we can fight in close order. And now, and fighting in close order, especially with helmets and shields as well as cuirasses, you can weather the storm of arrows. As to paraphrase, to quote Leonidas, "We'll fight in the shade." Right? That's how little he concerned himself with Persian archery. And so we definitely see that the defense with the Iron Age full body armor really does kind of swing to the infantry, which opens the way for what many call the Western way of war, which is close order shock formations. And in many ways, prior to the Iron Age, we don't really see this because we see the same loose order combat in the Trojan War and in Homeric poems. And so they're using the same Bronze Age technology as the Chinese and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and Hittites. So this shift that we'll pursue throughout the course of these upcoming lectures will be that iron, it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the rise of close order infantry formations. But that is the hallmark of Western formations throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages, and in large part is made possible due to iron technology.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And for our friend in the chat, Warhammer, who had mentioned the Vedas and in ancient India, there's also some interesting evidence, archaeological evidence, that they were smelting iron sometime in anywhere between 1600 to 1400 BC. So that's fairly interesting. I actually don't know to what extent, though, that the Vedas, that everyone in that area of the world were using iron, or to what extent it was part of civilian and military life. But I know that there was at least some smelting going on there. And just more broadly too, that there have been, with the earliest iron archaeological findings were from apparently 3300 BC in the Upper Nile Delta, and they were just iron beads found in a burial on a female body. So it's almost as if that there was like little isolated pockets of knowledge where iron smelting existed, but nothing that was really formalized. But we don't really get mass formations of men, like you were saying, in close order with helmets and shields and more sophisticated pieces of armor, really until you get to the Neo-Assyrians, because that's one of the reasons why they were able to be such an effective war machine for their time, and they were basically able to go through everyone who centuries earlier they were really struggling to fight against. So yeah, iron really obviously changed everything.
Yeah. Again, due to the scarcity of information on these sources, I don't really think there's a lot more we have to add. Is there anything you'd like to end before we wrap this up?
I think too it's important to mention that the Iron Age just happened in different regions of the world. For example, the Iron Age didn't happen until later on into Central, Western, and Northern Europe. However, there could be there's some speculation as to whether or not how early the Chinese were using it. So again, it was a global phenomenon for sure, and even the Nubians to the south had some iron smelting, but according to Fagan and I think it's Rosenband, that iron smelting came from the Egyptians and sort of knowledge passed down. But again, that's just highly speculative. And yeah, again, I think now the period that we're entering into, when we have Herodotus and the Greek city-states and the Lydians, and eventually what will get to be the Peloponnesian War and the Punic Wars, now that's when we have the development of really dynamic battlefield thinkers like Hannibal, and dynamic tactics really come into play. So yeah, but thanks for having me be part of this episode, and I look forward to the next one.
All right. Thank you. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.